everyone. Welcome to the Courtney Turner podcast. My guest today is returning, the incredible Leo Zagami. I was just telling of the Illuminati, and it is very timely, very, very timely book. This is called The History of Secret Societies and the Politics of the Jesuit New World Order and Their Luciferian Court. And of course, today is the first day of the Papal Conclave. Any of you who have seen the movie might have I don't know if that's a little predictive programming of what's to come, but we'll hear from the expert in just a minute here. I guess without further ado, from any more rambling from me, let's bring on Leo. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you very much for having me on. Very timely, as you said, a very important moment in the history of the Catholic Church. Every election of a new pope is an important and pivotal moment. For those who hope in some sudden change inspired by the Holy Spirit, I'm sorry to say that it's not going to go your way, but it's going to go the way of the Jesuits. And the Jesuits are the subject of my latest book that, as you have seen, is already a bestseller. And it's a book that I felt inspired to write as the last installment of my Confessions, which is a long series I started many years ago. You see, this is a project I started basically 20 years ago, which first of all went online as a blog. Then, of course, I was arrested for espionage, for exposing a bit too much. A lot of things happened in my life. In the end, I started to publish books because I find them probably it's easier to censor the internet than a book. The book you actually need to burn the book, if you have it physically. So in 2009, I started to publish my first Confessions in Japan. Then I was offered by the Vatican, as I explained in volume 12, to desist from publishing it in Italian. So that was the start that convinced me I was on a good, I was actually doing the right thing. And I also explained that in volume 3 of my Confessions. But I started with the Italian, and that was actually very successful until, of course, the Vatican and the Freemasons and the powers that control Italy got upset, and eventually they started to drop me from the main distribution. And then, of course, after I was forced, as you know, to leave Italy altogether and to give up on my Italian citizenship later on when I acquired the American one. So it was a long path which culminates in the controllers of the controllers, or the controllers of the control, which are the Jesuit order. And right from the start of this book, in the introduction, I explain what happened when I was in Rome, back in Rome after being forced to go back to Italy after being accused of espionage in Norway, and they offered me to participate to the promotion of the film Angels and Demons. And during this promotion, I was interviewed. I was doing a photo shoot with the Italian weekly magazine Panorama, and the Academy of the Illuminati, which was involved in it too, of Giuliano Di Bernardo. They brought me to the Jesuit general, and I saw in their way of acting. I mean, these are really powerful Freemasons and Illuminati, but in front of the Jesuit general, they were simply little children back at school almost, because the Jesuits' main mission has always been education, and because they have been able to control every single aspect, not only of the Catholic faith, but also many other faiths. Mm-hmm. And they have been very important in the development of Freemasonry, as I also explain in this book. So that was the moment I decided that I should maybe in the future write a book about the Jesuits. And then I had ulterior confirmation, as I explained right at the end of my book. I was at the Jesuit headquarters one day in front of it, going out of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, where I had breakfast. And there I met a couple of people that convinced me that maybe I should write this book. And a Dominican told me, Well, if you write it, just make sure that you write the truth, and we will accept even your worst criticism. And I said, okay, I will do that. It, of course, took me a number of years to become acquainted with my literary skills in order to challenge the Jesuits, because they are the professors, the scholars par excellence of the Vatican. You are actually dealing with the scientists of the Vatican. So if they want to debunk, if you don't write something that is correct, they will debunk you in a second. I mean, I didn't feel comfortable when I started writing books to challenge the Jesuits. Now, after all these years, I feel comfortable, and I reached to a point in which, with these 12 books, I really created a mini encyclopedia that in the future will be probably gathered by people as a testimony, not only of our times, but of the history of secret societies. And the reality of the Illuminati is also the reality of the Jesuits, because they are the ultimate controllers of everything. So I'm very glad to have concluded this installment with the Jesuits, and I did it, like I was telling you in private, in a moment in which Pope Francis' health was declining, and I really wanted this book to reach Pope Francis. Unfortunately, it didn't manage because he died on the day I was terminating the book. And in fact, I had to go back into the book and just put them in the past tense at that point, but also project myself in the future of the church again, which I already did during the writing of the book, to give final answers to those people who really want to know what is happening to the Catholic Church today, but also what is happening to the world today, because this is not a book only relevant to Catholics. This is a book relevant to everybody of any religion, as the Jesuits have, for example, done a Vatican-China deal, which we know very little about, which is also very influential in the choices that are done. And, at the state level, China controls every single religion. And for many decades, they persecuted Catholics, which formed almost an underground church until, from John Paul II onwards, they started to create an alliance, a possible alliance with the patriotic Catholic Church that eventually was sealed with the Jesuit Pope, and the pouring into the Vatican Bank of billions by the Chinese communism. So Chinese communists have almost bought the Vatican a little bit like the influence that America and the Allied forces had after the Second World War. They, of course, started to really influence heavily the Vatican. They had instituted lodges of Freemasonry within the Vatican, so they felt comfortable enough often to even decide, to veto certain cardinals, like it happened with Cardinal Siri in 1958, but also later on. So when this Jesuit Pope came into fruition, it presented to us the reality that we never imagined. I mean, almost all Catholics never imagined that a Jesuit could become a pope. I had been saying that for years. I've been warning people for years that that was the case, but nobody was taking me seriously. And then suddenly, of course, Pope Francis arrived, confirming all my worst fears. And he arrived, though, after a long story, which I also depict in this book, because the first Jesuit Pope is connected to a long story, a personal story, a story that goes through the dirty war in Argentina, the military junta, the P2 Lodge, him becoming a Freemason, him getting, even arguing with the Jesuit general of the time, who was very much left-leaning, and he wanted to be a little bit more conservative, but then reacquiring the blessings of the Jesuits when he renounced to become the commissioner of the Jesuit order under Ratzinger. So there is a long story that is told in this book, the birth of the St. Gallen Mafia, how the Jesuits have always decided what is their correct image of Jesus by being in charge of the Biblical Institute, the Pontifical Biblical Institute. So, I mean, the Jesuits have a leading say also in this conclave that is happening now, because, of course, the Jesuit Mafia the St. Gallen that was established in Switzerland is no longer active from 2014. But in the meantime, Pope Francis elected an enormous amount of cardinals, so he could completely rig the future of this conclave in his image. And
Wow.
the policies of the Jesuits are the policies that basically Pope Francis has brought forward and that Donald J. Trump is trying to oppose. I mean, I'm talking about the immigration policy. I'm talking about the transgender policies. I'm talking about every single thing that this current administration is trying to fight. The Democrats, which are the political arm of the Jesuits, as long as, along with their NGOs who have pushed millions of Catholics from Central and South America to colonize and rewrite the geopolitical, but also the political landscape of the United States of America. And this is really what my book is all about. My new book is about giving you a history lesson, but also a lesson about the present, not only because if we don't know the past, we can't really know the present. Sure. And of course, we can't know the future. So how the Jesuits are born, thanks to the rise of Protestantism, their controversial origins connected to the Alumbrados, which were the Illuminati of the time, Loyola's spiritual exercises, which are not so spiritual, Ignatius Loyola, who went from the prisons of the Inquisition to becoming the founder of this powerful order that went on to substitute the Dominicans in running the Inquisition, the creation of their pious frauds, which means to actually offer you a lie, but doing it like it is truth, and in the end justifying this lie because it's for the greater good of the church. So whatever, I can tell you all kinds of rubbish, but in the end it's a pious fraud. They are the creators of this Machiavellic way of doing. And then, of course, in my book, I explain the actual mission of the Jesuits in the educational field, but also the real belief system. I mean, these people are not Christians in any way, shape, or form. They are pagans. They worship Isis. The Holy Mary is Isis for them. The Holy Mary, but not only the Holy Mary is Isis, is also Cybele, which is another mother goddess of ancient Rome. I don't know if you had time when you were in Rome yourself to go to the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, Mary Major, which is outside of the Vatican, but it is the place which was chosen by Pope Francis to be buried for a specific reason. This place has a long tradition and a connection even with the first missionaries of the Jesuits who went to China. So I think that the Salus Popolo Romani, which is this Holy Mary image, needs to be reinterpreted completely. You see, from the beginning, from the founding, the Jesuits fostered this devotion for the Marian icon in Saint Maria Maggiore. But like I said, it's a cover-up for something much more insidious, and of course, like I said, not of a Christian nature. When I wrote, for example, and I published Volume 3, I showed myself in Volume 3 of my Confessions that in Santa Maria Maggiore we conducted the ceremony, the funeral for one of the last Grand Masters of the Knights Templars, present a lot of personalities from the Vatican, including General Marinelli, who used to be the late General Marinelli, is no longer with us, but he used to be called the General by John Paul II, and he was the head of his security. And he was there too, and I have a photo with him, the Templars, everything. So all this to demonstrate that in the end there was also a strong connection of Pope Francis with Freemasonry, aside from the Jesuits, and with, of course, the Knights Templars, the Neo-Templars, because they're not really the original Templars. And all this happened when, of course, the Bergoglio was in Argentina. He forged this connection with Freemasonry, which actually helped him in raising, his, after being a Jesuit, and having problems with the Jesuits because he was, like I said earlier, judged as too conservative. And he had covered for the kidnapping of two Jesuits who were kidnapped by the Argentinian dictatorship and left in an island blindfolded and tortured for 5 months. This, of course, made him lose his position as provincial father in 1978. So then he, like I said, he reacquired his position with the Jesuits a long time later when he refused to come in as a Jesuit who was then supposed to commission on behalf of Joseph Ratzinger. Now commissioning, John Paul II also wanted to commission the Jesuit order. They have always been deemed a threat from the church. And for this reason, it's important to understand that there is not really been many researchers writing books on the Jesuits in the last 40 years. Yeah. I calculate them on one hand, Malachi Martin, the middle of the 80s with the Jesuits, which was an essay. He also wrote some semi-fictional books. Malachi Martin was a former Jesuit, somebody who gave up on the Jesuits after working with Cardinal Bea, a Jesuit, during the Second Vatican Council. There was also another book which was very important of the Jesuits, written on the Jesuits, which was Eric John Phelps, which came out in the year 2000. There was another book also by Tupper Saucy, which was another book. But these are 3 books. And we're talking about 40 years here, Courtney. I mean, how many books, I make a question here, how many books there are that talk about hypothetical conspiracies of Freemason, Illuminati, or Jews? Because, the Jew also needs to be bashed. And there is many. There is many. I mean, you can go on Amazon and serve yourself with hundreds of titles every day.
Right.
But there is no books on the Jesuits because the Jesuits is a subject that is deemed dangerous, and it's also a challenging subject because, like I said, these are the professors. These are the ones who educate you, like you're saying, educated by the Jesuits. And educated by the Jesuits is people like Dr. Fauci, like Bill Clinton, like Nancy Pelosi, who was with her husband meeting in Georgetown University and very close to the Jesuits too. So then where do these people end up, these people educated from the Jesuits? Now, in my book, I'm very clear about Donald J. Trump. He was educated by the Jesuits for 2 years, and he refused to become part of this charade when he refused to join 2 of the most important secret societies on campus. And there is testimony, which I bring in my book, about Trump rejecting all this. And they are absolutely furious with Trump rejecting the Jesuit ideal. And this is an exclusivity, of course, of my book, like many other exclusivities of my book. But I mean, that is something, when you're talking Donald J. Trump today, a lot of people, especially, all these keyboard wizards we have these days, are like, Donald Trump is a Jesuit. That is an accusation he often receives. And I'm like, do you know what Trump did for them? Do you know that Trump pissed them off, angered them? And to this day, there is people, and I actually relate their testimony in my book, who hate Trump because he betrayed the Jesuit progressive ideals. So those people need to know that I was a student of the Jesuits myself. See, this is me. Just a second, here, the one here.
Oh, yeah.
Next to the guy with the mustache. I had a bit more hair back then. And of course, here is one of the most important Jesuit agents of the Second World War, which was Don Paolo Pecoraro, who during the Second World War founded an alliance between the communists and the Catholics to fight Mussolini. So I grew up with these people. I grew up in a school which was dedicated to Giovanangelo Braschi, the Pope, who during the suppression of the Jesuits attempted to rehabilitate them and freed the Jesuit general. So people need to get their facts right. And this book is about facts, not fiction. In fact, there is over 500 footnotes, citations, and quotes from reliable sources. And like you said, it's number one in history of religions, his essays and all that, faith and spirituality. I mean, imagine if I didn't write the correct thing, what kind of backlash I would receive from the Jesuit institutions.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, they're very harsh critics.
The very harsh critics. I mean, I'm exposing their top of the top, people like Father Martin, which is like today the founder of Outreach, and all the LGBTQ community. They love Father James Martin, like he's some kind of god. Ooh. And he's all about the rainbows and unicorns in the church of Father James Martin, who is one of the editors at large of America, the Jesuit Review, which, by the way, has also presented in 2018 Alexander Ocasio-Cortez. So to actually go from the history of the Jesuits, and here he is. I mean, somebody made a joke. I remember I was watching like a meme or something on the internet. They picked up one of the characters of Conclave, which is recited by Tucci, I think, by that actor who does also a bit of cooking with his glasses. And they said, "Oh, wow, we have Father Martin in the Conclave." Now they made a joke out of it. Because, of course, if we ever have Father Martin in a conclave, that conclave is going to be the most queer conclave in the history of conclaves. However, it's not so
in the movie
as it goes. Here is the movie. Now, let's talk about this movie.
In the movie, they pick a transgender or an intersex.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. In my book, I talk about this movie, of course, because I mean, I said to myself, why not use the poptastic conclave to actually draw some conclusions? And I want to, you see, in the Catholic media, like the Catholic News Agency and other, they have criticized the conclave because they say, "Wow, it's missing all the prayers, the contemplation, the Holy Spirit." No, this book is the film Conclave is actually, I must say, the guys really caught the real spirit, not the fake spirit which is projected by the mainstream that is telling us that the Holy Spirit is going to come down from the Sixtine Chapel and bestow upon this holy man some kind of holy inspiration. That is all BS. and of course, Conclave has some interesting points. In the end, like you said, they elect an hermaphrodite, which is even more of a. That was the guy Tucci who looks like Father Martin. But there is some problems in this movie. Okay, there is a little bit of mix-up between the figure of the deacon, decano, and the camerlengo. Well, these are, let's say, minor technicalities that, of course, were missed by Hollywood, but that's okay. I will say that the film, though, gives also the false impression that today, in 2025 or 24, when the movie came out, whenever, there is some kind of opposition by a traditional, lobby of cardinals that is there with this Italian. There is no opposition when you have nominated 80% of the conclave and you need only 75 two-thirds to reach the quorum and elect a pope. There is no opposition. I mean, so they have this character, which is, I think, the actor Castellitto there in the movie, the Italian guy, who is supposed to be the conservative guy who comes out after the bombings by the Muslims and says, ooh, ooh, ooh. And then, we have this mysterious guy from Afghanistan, wherever, the diocese of Kabul, who then will be elected, who says, "Oh, but you haven't understood. The religion cannot be used in this way. We have to be like kumbaya." Here he is. And so there is, of course, fiction and there is reality.
Mm-hmm.
I find very racist the fact that the black guy in Conclave ends up being accused of having a love affair with a nun 30 years before, and is kicked out because he has a love affair with a nun, when the majority of cardinals probably in that conclave, as well as any other conclave, have slept with little boys and seminarians. So it is telling us the truth. The cardinals in Africa, they still like women, which is actually, they like nuns, which is, then you have in the movie Conclave also the figure, which I talk about in my book, of the Jesuitess. The Jesuitess are the female Jesuits, the nuns, and that is Isabella Rossellini in the movie. Okay. The Jesuitess is a trustworthy figure, is a strong figure, like Rossellini is enacting in Isabella Rossellini in this movie. The Jesuitess is actually one of the last characters you will meet in my book, because at the completion of my book, that's where it all ends, with me and my encounter with a Jesuitess, so the Jesuitess is an important figure. Mm-hmm. Now, there is a number of nun orders who follow the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius, and they are called Jesuitess because they go directly to the Jesuit general, the Black Pope as is known, the Father Superior General, and they, of course, obey him. Now, when I first encountered a Jesuitess, I really was surprised, because I always heard about Jesuits. I never heard about female Jesuits. And she was like, no, we exist, Leo, we exist. And I'm actually the secretary of the Jesuit general, so I will relay your message to him. And that is, you will find in the last chapter of my book. So there is, of course, direct experiences, but there is also the history of my family, because this is the Lion family in particular is judged as a very remarkable family in the history of the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. Especially because we had one of the sergeant in arms of the Knights Templars who went to Scotland with Sinclair and then became the foundation for the lodge, the Mother Lodge of Freemasonry, Heirdom of Kilwinning, but also for the remnants of the Knights Templars. However, this vacuum was way too big for the Vatican, and as I explained in my book, the Jesuits decided that they had to fill that vacuum with this new order 2 centuries later. The Jesuit came along, and the Jesuit became the new Templars. However, the difference is that the Templars were warrior knights, right, going around with swords, able to kill people openly, but in a dignified and knighthood way. The Jesuits, instead, they're slimy old bastards who will say, we are not a religious military order, we are just religious, even if they have a general. And then they will poison you in the middle of the night or slash your throat. So the Jesuits are more insidious. They're not as, the knighthoods, even like the Knights of Malta used to be once upon a time a courageous knighthood order. Followed a little bit in the footsteps of the Templars. But when they rebelled to Pope Francis, like I explained in my book, they were severely punished, and in 2022 they were commissioned, their statute and their constitution was overturned, and they are no longer the same. So the Knights Templars were inspirational, but the mission of the Knights Templars was, as you know, banking. And banking was, at that point, by the time Ignacio Loyola came around, it was no longer a novelty. It was like the genie came out of the bottle. So, you can't bring together the Jesuits with the mission of banking, because it will not have worked out. Even if some of the founding Jesuits were Jews and maybe could have worked these things out, their mission was immediate education. And that's what they focused on, because education is about controlling the elite, controlling the masses, and writing the narrative and writing the history.
That's right.
And right from the start of my book, I explain, God only knows how history was, in a way, accepted before the age of the internet or television. It was accepted because there were secret societies, but there was also the church, who were deciding. So the Jesuit element, a mission, meaning education, which prevails in the Constitution, there is two elements which prevail. One is the mission, and the mission is, of course, to bring this education, but also to write at that point to become the people who decide the correct version of history. But then also you have the vows of the Jesuits, and in particular the fourth vow of absolute obedience to the Pope. That's what really convinced the Pope in 1540 to bless and accept this new order amongst the Catholic Church, because the fourth vow was a little bit like something they were missing with the other orders. This was an order that said, in the fourth vow, we have, three vows that the traditional normal Jesuits who don't take the fourth vow take, and that is, of course, chastity, poverty, and obedience. But obedience in the sense of an obedience to their Jesuit general who is in charge. Then you have the fourth vow, which is for the missions. And that fourth vow is of absolute obedience to the Pope. You become, in that way, a 007, because if the Pope asks you to go and murder somebody and is even contrary to the Catholic or Christian faith, you still have to do it because you have taken the fourth vow. That made the Jesuits the ideal intelligence operatives on behalf of the Vatican, and that's why, like I explained in my book, 20 years after the foundation of the Jesuit Order, the Vatican decided to found their own intelligence service called the Holy Alliance initially, and then later on the entity. So the fourth vow of obedience to the Pope regarding the missions is absolutely singular, and it describes the identity of an order that no longer was just a religious order, but was something else. Because the Pope will, for example, order them to infiltrate during the Reformation other churches, to infiltrate foreign countries, to go in a foreign country not dressed up as a priest, but actually to accustom and go around as the locals. If they arrived when another singularity of the missions of the Jesuits is that the first missions were conducted not only in Europe on behalf of the Pope for the counter-reformations, but also in the East. Here it says, Benedict asked Jesuits to reflect deeply on their vow of obedience to him. That's also an important thing, because in my book I explained that yes, they take the fourth vow to the Pope, but ultimately they will always have their own. So when you showed that article in regards to Ratzinger, who asked at the time Adolf Nicholas, who was back then the Black Pope, because that's how we call the Jesuit general, the Black Pope, while then the White Pope is the Pope everybody knows. And instead, the Black Pope operates from a place called Borgo Santo Spirito, and Borgo Santo Spirito number 4 to be exact. That's where it is. And when he asked Adolf Nicholas to reflect on the fourth vow of total obedience to him, it was because the Jesuits often disregard the fourth vow, because when their own Jesuit general tells them to obey the fourth vow, first of all, they have to obey him. Then they have to obey the Pope. That is the whole thing here. So, yes, the fourth vow was a way for Ignacio Loyola to have the order accepted, but then it became also a way that often created confusion even amongst the popes that were surprised about the way the Jesuits were just going along their own business without respecting what he was commanding, and were instead in the hands always of their Jesuit general. Because, I repeat, this fourth vow is first of all filtered through the Jesuit general. If he says it's okay, okay. If he doesn't say it's not okay, it's not okay. That's why at one point, the actual situation in the 1760s became so tense that countries like France, Portugal, Spain started to suppress the Jesuits, kick them out of their educational institutes and stuff, because, of course, that's where they started their work of intelligence operatives through the educational field as a cover-up, mostly. Their missions often used education as a cover-up or knowledge as a cover-up, a little bit like when they arrived for the first time in China and they offered astronomy and mathematics in exchange for Chinese knowledge, which eventually led to them being the first ones to translate the art of war of Sun Tzu and bringing it to the Western world. So
the Jesuits did.
The Jesuits in 1772, Father Amiot translated, amongst other treatises of importance, The Art of War, which was eventually then at that point published in French and immediately used by a little guy from Corsica known as Napoleon. So the way that the Jesuits operate is always for the interest of the church, of course, but also for their own interest. And that's why in 1773, after all these people had suppressed the order, even the Pope was forced into suppressing the order, and they were kicked out of the Vatican for a number of years. Now, the suppression of the Jesuits led to some paradoxes in a way, because they were protected by the Empress in Russia, which is Orthodox, in exchange of having somebody of like as general. They still, of course, kept control over certain parts of Eastern Europe, like in parts of contemporary Poland or Ukraine. Their way that they worked, the Jesuits, was very insidious even back then, always, and it led to them being persecuted over and over again. When a monarch will open his eyes to the danger of this religious order, that in reality was not a religious order, but a secret society that was working for creating their own project, because, yes, it's true, they worked for the Vatican, but it's also true that their own project started to creep in from the 16th, 17th century, and it was a project for eventually creating a one-world religion, even back then. People like Queen Christina of Sweden were converted by the Jesuits. She gave up, she abdicated from the throne, she went to Rome, she started to study alchemy, the occult, with Athanasius Kircher, who was himself a professor at the Collegium Romanum, which was the second university. Now there is the Lateranense, is descending from the Collegium Romano, which is the pontifical university. The Lateranense is the most prestigious, in fact, in Rome, and is behind the Church of San Giovanni Laterano. But at the time, the Collegium Romano, the first college, which also led to the first astronomical laboratory, was built on the remains of the biggest temple in ancient Rome of Isis. So there was always this whole thing of worshipping the mother goddess in reality, the goddess of nature. Then, of course, they are very clever in selling themselves to the common folk as, we're just a bunch of priests, and that's it. But in reality, like I explained in my book, these were no ordinary priests. They were priests that they were used by the Vatican even to attempt the murder of Elizabeth I. So sculptures of the Temple of Isis and Serapis, if you go and see where the sculptures are today, you will, of course, not be surprised. They end up in the Vatican Museum. So where do you think they're going to end up? But the actual place where they were originally was this incredible temple, which then was destroyed, and then, of course, they rebuilt on top of it the Collegium Romanum, the Roman college. So if you actually put the Temple of Isis and then you put the Collegium Romanum, you will get the actual fact that the Jesuits built their second and most important university in that place. And that place, which of course became the foundation and the formation of all the Jesuits missionaries abroad, So you see, when they went abroad, they were also inclined to bring their own knowledge, science or occult knowledge even, in exchange of the local knowledge. People like Ippolito Desideri, for example, was the first Western missionary to arrive in Tibet and then convert to become himself a Lama. You know, he wasn't really bringing himself as a Christian. He wanted to absorb the local culture and retrieve it and bring it back to Rome. That was the Matteo Ricci. You can find on the internet. Matteo Ricci has a shrine still to this day in China. And he was an assistant to the emperor, but so many other Jesuits became important. Shanghai will never exist as a port that it is today without the help of the Jesuits. This is a fact, not fiction. The French poured in billions at the time through the Jesuits also to build up Shanghai as a scientific also hub for their, for the future. So, you see, the first Catholic pope in China, Matteo Ricci. I mean, come on, guys. It survived hundreds of years of Chinese history. And people think that the Jesuits have this strong link with China that eventually will bring the Chinese to invest billions after the election of the first Jesuit pope. But it was also this link that was forged through decades with the Catholic Chinese Patriotic Association, which is the Catholic Communist Church. Yes, it is a paradox, but Mao Zedong in 1957, when he saw that these Catholics in China didn't want to give up on their faith, but at the same time they were communists. I know it's a contradiction in terms, no? But in reality,
expedient though.
It is a way for Mao Zedong to not throw away hundreds of years of culture and of course you see the Jesuits in that image you just showed. Were they dressed as Jesuits? Yeah. Not really. They were dressed up as Chinese Confucius followers. And in fact, the Jesuits went back to the Vatican and tried to convince for 6 popes. The Jesuits went there and said, we have to embrace the Confucius rituals. We have to embrace the Confucius. And the Vatican said, we can't embrace that. It's contrary to Christianity. No, but we could maybe mix it up a little bit, spice it up and get it together. And in the end, a pope had to say to the Jesuits, give up on this thing. We're not going to bring Confucius among Christianity here. However, only maybe 90 years ago, things changed in the Vatican, started to change. And then with the Second Vatican Council, we have the big change. And the Jesuits knew that big change that was also made possible thanks to Freemasonry was the change they were looking for. And that's where the Jesuits with Padre Pedro Rupe, which was this very important black pope, started to go the way of climate change, building up all the mythology behind climate change, building up all the policies of the left that we have today. Right. Because that's what it is. But in this book, I explain how the Jesuits are. You have the Jesuits of the 3 vows, you have the 4th vow, but you have also the 5th class. And the 5th class is people like Nancy Pelosi. And nobody has the courage. I think the last one who talked about the 5th class of the Jesuits was probably in a book published in the 1850s or 60s. I mean, we're talking about nobody has even the courage of mentioning the 5th class Jesuits, because they are not only men, but also women who obey directly to the superior general of the Society of Jesus.